just lapel mic whenever you're ready. It's good to go.
Okay.
And you just gotta pass it up to Ray.
Sorry? Yeah. Oh. I was hoping to sit there.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
You can always do there are empty seats.
I'm just about to do that. There are a couple of, oh boy, this does work. There are a couple of empty seats right in the front. So if you've got your tomatoes, if you sit here, you can probably hit Ray more effectively. So fill up. There are enough people at the back. There's seats right in the front. Come on, be brave. No one moves. I tried. No one wants to sit next to Bill Clark. It's just one of those things. Except that seat, that's mine. Sorry? Oh, there'll be one over there. Okay, we got anybody else outside ready to come? Otherwise, we want to hear what Ray's got to say. Oh, introduce myself. Oh, okay. Apparently I've got to introduce myself. Welcome, everybody, to the what year are we at? 18 Bevan series, which is the 19th, Julia? Between Julia and I, we usually can get this plus minus 1 or 2. 18th? Okay, it's the 18th Bevan series. The Bevan series is, of course, the highlight of our calendar in terms of seminars. We link the Bevan series with 2 classes, but for purposes of today, the most important thing is we bring in awesome and amazing speakers. Before I get into details of today's speaker, I should introduce myself. I'm Andre Punt. I'm the director of the school and very proud to be here again today. So I'm sure Ray's got something to say today. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ray. I've known Ray for the better part of 30 years, and I don't think I've ever introduced you before, have I, Ray? I don't think so. Yeah. So what do you say about Ray Hilborn? Quite a lot, depending on who you talk to. Some of it relatively polite. It's fair to say Ray is the guy that needs no introduction. I first heard of Ray when I started my master's career before at least half of you were born, which is a little depressing to think about. And my major professor said, all you've got to do is do what this guy did 20 years before your master's degree and you will get a degree. And I was given a whole pile of papers by Ray and suddenly discovered that this whole graduate thing was perhaps more difficult than I thought it was going to be. But it's fair to say that over time, I discovered that Ray was the man you did want to follow. He's a great example in so many different ways. The first way I discovered exactly how marvelous he was, I met him for the first time in a meeting in Madrid in 1989. And Ray was an active participant in the meeting and then showed exactly how important he found adopting the report. I had the misfortune of writing the report of the meeting, and Ray was the invited expert. We'd flown him halfway around the world, and we gave him the report, and he went upstairs, and he was going to read the report. And 2 hours later, he hadn't come back downstairs yet, and we thought, boy, we need to look at this report. And those of you who know Ray, what was going on? He was fast asleep. So that was the first lesson that I learned from Ray. The second lesson I learned was be prepared. In 1991, again, a while ago, Ray was the keynote speaker at a conference in South Africa. And I was the little graduate student who had to help out with the illustrious Dr. Hilborn. And so we went to Ray and said, Ray, we've flown you halfway around the world. We spent all our budget on you. Could you give us your slides? Okay, who remembers what a slide is? Yeah, okay, that's depressing. And Ray said, no slides. And so we thought, oh, that's okay. Dr. Hilborn, could we have your overheads? And he said, there are no overheads. And then we realized, Ray, have you actually prepared this talk? And then he gave the most magnificent talk, which, if you are interested in population dynamics, starts with something like, in dark rooms around the world, the priesthood gather. So if that doesn't mean anything to you, talk to me afterwards. And at least several members of the priesthood are actually in the audience. I don't have time to go into how many different fields Ray has had an impact in. When I first met him, I would have called him a stock assessment scientist. He's delved beyond that into fisheries management, world food security, irritating Daniel Pauly, you name it. His production is amongst the greatest I think we've ever seen at the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. By my count, with a CV of about 0.2, I would say, he's published about 250 papers. Ray, is that plus minus 20%? Maybe. His H-index is just too depressing for words, so I won't mention what it is. And of course, he's written 3 books over the years. His impact on graduate education will last essentially forever. By my count, with a CV of about 0.1, in the 30 years he's been here, he came, that was the other piece of advice he gave me, which I will convey, which is don't go through tenure. So Ray was appointed in the school as a full professor, so he didn't have to go through the whole stress of going through tenure and promotion. Definitely something to follow through. And over his career, he's chaired 17 master's committees, 33 PhD committees. But my greatest statistic is that Ray is the only person I know whose CV could have a section called Major Awards and Other Awards. Ray has basically won every award that there is in fisheries that's available. Just last year, just to read a couple of things, he won the International Fisheries Science Prize, which is given out by the World Council of Fisheries Association once every 4 years. There were several applications, nominations. I believe the committee met for about 12 minutes when they saw Ray's application. And he also, at the same year, was awarded the university faculty lecturer here at UW. Again, I could continue forever. I don't think that you want to hear that much more from me. In fact, this is more than enough you've ever wanted. So I'm going to hand over to Ray. There is a title, but based on my experience with Ray, whatever he says is going to be unrelated to what the title is, but is almost certainly going to be highly entertaining. Ray.
Well, thank you, Andre, for that brief introduction. And I just don't think I have time to talk about the snotty-nosed PhD student who came up here from South Africa at one point, but now he's my boss. So it is a real pleasure to kick off the Bevan series this year and to have such good attendance. So I thought my title is, I think Julia wrote this title for me, is U.S. Fisheries Policy Working, Getting the Message to Congress. And I am going to talk about that, but first I just wanted, because I suspect many of you don't know Don Bevan and know very little, didn't know Don Bevan, don't know very much about him. This is the horrible picture, the only one I could find of him. He was the Dean of the College of Fisheries at one point. He was very involved in Magnuson-Stevens related work very early on in the process. I He was on the SSC of the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, and I suspect a whole bunch of others, but I couldn't find the documentation. He was very active in Alaska salmon research and also in Columbia River research, and this series is in his memory. I feel compelled to always begin my talks now with a disclosure of funding. And I have to say I haven't updated this lately, but depending, with the kind of CV Andre was dealing with, more or less about half of my funding in the last 10 years has come from foundations, Packard, Walton, and Moore being the biggest chunk of that for Alaska salmon, a fair amount of 25% from government, about 3% from NGOs. And if you're from an NGO, I would love to have more. And about 13% from commercial fishing interests, and 9% which I would call community groups. And these are mostly small community groups in Alaska that are interested in salmon fishing. Anyway, I'm mostly going to tell some stories. And this one starts in 2007 with this group of people. This was a National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, aka NCES, located in Santa Barbara, study group that Boris Worm and I put together after Boris was the lead author on an article that said if current trends continue, all fish stocks will be collapsed by 2048. That was pretty controversial. It did make the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Seattle newspapers, and BBC Evening News, television news. But a lot of us who had worked in fisheries that we thought were sustainable and were going to not be gone by 2048 wrote critiques of it, and ultimately Boris and I got together and say, why do we have such different views about the state of world fisheries? And that really got me into sort of thinking about this at a global level. In 2009, this group published this paper, Rebuilding Global Fisheries, and that became, then led to a briefing of congressional staff that Boris Worm and I went to Washington, D.C. to discuss and present the results of our work, primarily to congressional staff. It was organized by Compass, and Amanda Stanley, former alum of UW, is now the head of Compass, and she has a really competent staff in Washington, D.C. who know how to get the message to Congress. And Boris and I spent 2 days visiting different congressional offices, making presentations to staffers. I think it's called the Congressional Research Office. Anyway, this is another NCES working group that has just wound up, which is really following up on the original NCES group, looking at not sort of what's happened to the status of fish stocks, but also expanding our horizons, say, well, what's the relationship between how fisheries are managed and the outcomes? And we did another Compass organized briefing just last October, and so Olaf Jensen on my right and Julia Baum on my left were 3 members of the group, and who could get away for a couple days, and we went to Washington, D.C. and did another briefing pretty well along the same lines. One presentation to all the interested staff members, visits to quite a few individual House and Senate members' offices. And then it just sort of by coincidence, while we were there, the Senate the Congress is in the process of considering Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization. And the Senate held a formal hearing. And so what that means is they invite, in this case, 4 people to come and give 5 minutes of what we think should be done about Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization. Now, I do not have a picture of that, but this was the picture of the briefing we did for staff, and it takes place in the same room. The difference is that during the real congressional hearing, or the Senate hearing, you're facing the other way, and those seats have, some of them have senators in them, and the senators tend to come and go over the course of your 5 minutes. Anyway, so what I want to do now is first just go back to the Magnuson-Stevens Act and talk about, okay, what is it trying to achieve? And then in the course of what Andre left me, 20 minutes or so like that, I will, try to just say, okay, well, given what the Act says we should be trying to do with our fisheries, how well are we doing? And then identify, come back and then say what I told Congress, and then talk a little bit about what it takes, at least my perceptions on how you get the message to Congress. So I'm just going to quickly whip through some of the text of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. I've never read the whole thing. I've read the beginning. So it starts off with findings, and I've just highlighted that fisheries resources contribute to food, economy, and provide recreation. So these are the things that we're obviously interested in as a nation. Commercial and recreational fishing constitutes a major source of employment, so that's another thing we want our fisheries to do. There's some problem. National program is needed, necessary to prevent overfishing, rebuild overfished stocks. That's certainly on our agenda. Habitats is there, data is there, and again, back to loss of habitat. So there's a whole bunch of things we're trying to do in fisheries. And I want to distinguish between what we want and what's constraining it. So if you look at this list, you see we want food, we want economy, we want recreation, but we're concerned that overfishing and the unrebuilt fish stocks or overfished fish stocks are constraining our ability. We're concerned that loss of habitat may be constraining our ability, and in fact, the lack of data might be constraining our ability to achieve what we really want. And what we want is those first things. We want food, we want jobs, we want recreation. That's what we want from our fisheries. So then, if you work a little farther down, it says, okay, what's the purpose? The purpose is to promote fishing, okay? The purpose is to maintain on a continuing basis optimum yield. Purpose, to encourage the development of fisheries that are currently underutilized. These are all purposes, okay? And then optimum yield's a big deal, okay? So what do we mean by optimum yield? And one of the bottom lines of my talk, you can probably leave after that, is that this is so vague, it hasn't really helped us, okay? The optimum yield means the amount of fish which can provide the greatest overall benefit to the nation, particularly with respect to food production and recreational opportunities, taking into account the protection of marine ecosystems. So on the one hand, we want to generate food, we want to generate recreation, but we have to be careful to protect the marine ecosystems. But there's more objectives. Necessary to prevent overfishing and rebuild overfished stocks, to ensure the conservation of fish habitats, to make sure that we can realize the full potential of the nation's fisheries resources. Okay, now, this is my theme, okay? What gets measured gets managed. And Peter Drucker is often credited with this. I did 20 minutes of internet research and discovered it's much more complicated than that. Nobody can really figure out who first said this, and it's like many aphorisms, it's found in a whole bunch of guises. So, here is the bottom line. This is from NOAA Fisheries website. Since 1996, NOAA Fisheries has reported on the status of U.S. fisheries as required by the Magnuson-Stevens Act. Reporting on the status of fish stocks provides fisheries managers and the public with account of how well current fisheries management measures are working. So, very simple. We measure the status of fish stocks, and we know how well our fisheries management measures are working. Okay? This is basically my major indictment of American fisheries policy, is we've mistakenly equated status of fish stocks with performance of fisheries. So NOAA reports to Congress, and they used to, well, they still do report how many stocks are overfished, how many stocks are subject to overfishing, but now they've got a more sophisticated fishery sustainability index, and you see that it has been getting remarkably better over the last 15 years. And by any measure, the status of American fish stocks has been improving. This sustainability index is based on a number of things. For each stock unit that's officially managed, they give it a score of is the status known? And in the U.S. parlance, we distinguish between overfished and overfishing. Overfished is an abundance measure. How many fish are there? Overfishing is a fishing harvest rate measure. Are we taking too many? And if you know it, of both of those, then you get at least 1 point. And then if overfishing isn't occurring, that is, if you're not fishing too hard, you get another point. If the stock is above the overfished level, you get another point. And then if it's distinctly above the overfished level, you get yet another point. Okay, so let's look at some individual regions. And so this is just the abundance of fish stocks normalized, so forget the units, for the 4 major regions of the U.S. Alaska, U.S. East Coast, Southeastern Gulf, and U.S. West Coast. And what you see is that the lower 3, everything, Alaska's sort of been pretty stable as a place we never had a lot of overfishing. But U.S. East Coast, Southeast Coast, and Gulf all started to turn around and increase in the mid-1990s. Okay? And there was a reason for that. The red lines are fishing pressure, essentially the fraction of the stocks that are harvested. And what we saw is that beginning in the mid-1990s, more or less corresponding to the 1996 reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, fishing pressure has been reduced in the U.S., in some cases quite dramatically. And this NC's group, the one that's just wrapped up, I mean, it's really a simple story. If you want to rebuild fish stocks, you have to lower fishing pressure. And when you do that, most of the time, but not all the time, you get your stocks to rebuild. Okay. What about social and economic performance? Going back to what gets measured gets managed. It certainly doesn't have the profile, but NOAA does report some other things. So this is the 2015 status of fish stocks by the numbers. And I think this really reflects the big picture, okay? I don't know, what is this? 75% of the area of this graph, of this chart, is devoted to stock status. How many stocks are overfished? How many are subject to overfishing? How many have rebuilt? The sustainability index, okay. But there is actually some other stuff about fishing. There are jobs and there are estimates of, in this case, commercial and recreational value. So it's not as if, you know, I mean, I see Dan Holland, we've got economists, and they do some of this analysis. But in terms of the big picture, most of the emphasis in reporting to Congress has been the sustainability index. So how are we doing with respect to landings? Okay, this is just total U.S. seafood landings from 1950 to 2015, or maybe 16, I can't remember. And what you see is that there was a really big boom in U.S. landings in the 1980s, leading into the 1990s, corresponding to a great extent to the development of Alaskan fisheries and Americanization, which was a very strong motivation of the original Magnuson-Stevens Act. But since then, there's really been no increase. Okay, and so since 1990, fish catches haven't been going up. Now, I hope the light goes on, but wait a minute. The abundance of stocks is going up. Okay. This is from, again, another NOAA report, and this is just looking at the time trend. In the vertical bars are the pounds of fish, and the black line is the national value of landings corrected for inflation. And essentially, landings and value of American fisheries have been very stable for the last 20 years. So, are we achieving our objectives? If the goal is to rebuild stocks, the answer is yes. But if the goal is to provide food, jobs, and support community, is there really any evidence that rebuilding is leading to the anticipated increases in benefits? So the assumption is that we're constrained by overfished stocks. Let's rebuild those overfished stocks and we will have more benefits. Remembering that rebuilding is not the objective. Rebuilding is what we believed we needed to do in order to increase the benefits to the nation. Now, there's some pretty clear examples of where it's worked quite well. So this is the second most valuable fishery in the United States, the Atlantic sea scallop fishery. How many people know what the most valuable fishery in the United States is? And no, it's not pollock, Vic. Lobster. It's lobster in Maine, yeah. And this is a fishery that rebuilt dramatically as they discovered a better way to manage it, which was rotational harvesting. They also got very lucky, and the catch went up quite a bit. It's come down in the last couple of years. I have data. I'm interested in that. But you definitely saw stock rebuilding. You saw catches go up. Gulf red snapper. First, I want to point out, that most of this rebuilding, certainly in this case, it began a long time ago, 25 years ago. Really accelerated in the last few years, and we have started to see in the last, say, 7 or 8 years, the catch of Gulf red snapper start to increase. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to go back. One advantage of being an old fart is you can go back a long time, and this actually isn't that long ago, but in 1998, the National Research Council had a review of Northeast stock assessments. And if you're followed, it used to be that U.S. fisheries policy and national standards are being driven by New England. That's now changed. It's mostly about the Gulf of Mexico. But Liz Clark, who's here in the front row, was a National Research Council staffer, and she put together this report, and it was chaired by Terry Quinn. And Andre failed to mention that this is the 100th year of the School of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences. There will be a number of... is it 1919? Yeah. Oh, next year will be the 100th year. He was always better with numbers than I am. But point out that Terry Quinn, who was the chair, is one of our alumni, as was Anna Parma, who's on there. And I was on there, and we basically went. And for me, it was a total shock to go to Gloucester. And I mean, I worked with fishermen in Canada, New Zealand, here, and I always thought, fishermen are pretty reasonable people. If you get to the New England, you would come away with a different impression. Anyway, what we basically said is, your stocks are overfished. You guys just have to bite the bullet. You have to rebuild your stocks. You have to take the short-term pain in order to get some long-term gain. Okay? And that's basically what stock rebuilding has often been about. But has it worked? Well, we saw that it worked for red snapper, worked for Atlantic scallops. Hasn't really worked for West Coast groundfish. So this is the non-whiting catch off the West Coast, which peaked with a catch of about 130,000 tons back in the 1980s, and it has been going down ever since. Remember, it's been building an abundance since here. Abundance has been going up, but catch has been going down. Interesting. New England, it's just a classic dismal one-way trip. It's just been getting worse and worse and worse. But remember, since the mid-1990s, the abundance of fish stocks in New England has been rebuilding. So with these mixed stock fisheries, we've seen a lot of pain, but we haven't seen the gain. And again, I haven't had a chance to really do this in detail, but I mean, I think it really has to do with whether it's a targeted fishery or a mixed stock fishery. And so we've seen, there's no question that higher abundance from a fishing perspective is good, because it usually means higher catch rates and often lower costs of fishing. But we've seen pain in the form of reduced catch, reduced employment, and in many places losses of working waterfronts. Now, this isn't all because of the fisheries management. Working waterfronts are being bought out by condos. It's a complicated picture, but lots of pain. Now, again, taking advantage of my seniority, I told you so. Okay, so we had the New England report in 1998, and in 2000, one of my most prestigious publications was in National Fisherman, and Andre didn't include that one. It would have been 251, I think. And I really sat down and said, why is it that it's, I mean, first I was shocked at the at the anger of the Gloucester fishermen. I mean, it was really impressive. And I think you could probably go there now and see the same thing. But I said, okay, what is their problem? And I realized they had a whole bunch of quite legitimate reasons that they were pissed off. So we, the science community, was saying, rebuild your stocks, things will be better. Well, there's a bunch of reasons they might not. First is that in almost any fishery that is not doing very well, there's a lot of inactive fishing permits. So let me just hypothetically say there's 500 permits, but only 200 people are fishing. Well, if all of a sudden the fishery starts to be profitable, many of those permits that are not being fished will come out of the woodwork and someone will start fishing them, which means that the people who are paying the pain are not getting all of the gain. Okay? Then there's another concern that simply, okay, will the TAC actually increase after rebuilding? Interestingly enough, the answer seems to be yes, and I'll show you that for the West Coast. But the big problem is that multi-species fisheries can't have everything at maximum sustainable yield. That we can't go out and drag a net through the water and catch 2% of Pacific Ocean perch, but get 20% of Dover sole. You end up, multi-species or mixed stock management is a compromise where you can't target a harvest rate perfectly on each species. So another question is the gain worth the pain? In other words, how much gain is there going to be, how much pain? And when I wrote this, I had just been involved in a court case in New Zealand where for a number of arcane reasons having to do with New Zealand law, the fishermen were told they had to take a 40% catch reduction for 20 years to get an 8% increase in catch. Okay? And I wrote a testimony to the New Zealand court. I said no sensible person would take a 40% salary cut for 20 years to get a promised 8% pay rise. So is the gain worth the pain? You really should look at that. And then the fishermen also had a lack of confidence in overfish definitions and the assessment of what's overfished. And Andre, how many stocks have been declared overfished and then subsequently the newer assessments decided they weren't really overfished?
About 35%.
35, yeah. So there's a is that a type 1 or a type 2 error? Anyway, stocks get declared overfished even if they aren't overfished. And certainly there's the other kind, that stocks are certainly not declared overfished when they probably were overfished. But anyway, now also just more of reminiscences. This is the first paper in fisheries I wrote. It was pages 1 to 5 of the 1976 Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences, and it was looking at how you manage mixed stock fisheries. And in reality, all I was doing was a little bit fancier computing than Bill Ricker and Pete Larkin had done 20 years earlier. But anyway, I've been interested in mixed stock fisheries. And the bottom line with mixed stock fisheries is that if you want to maximize the yield, jobs, or profits in a mixed stock fishery on a sustainable basis, then weak stocks will be overfished and strong stocks will be underfished. So the harvest rate you choose is a compromise that gives you the highest maximum yield. And you've got to remember that being overfished does not mean going extinct. It does not even mean declining. It simply means it is being fished at a rate that is higher than would produce maximum yield. And that's the fundamental dilemma we have with mixed stock fisheries. But again, I want to emphasize there are benefits to maintaining stocks at a higher abundance than would produce maximum yield in the mix. That is, you would have the higher abundance means higher CPUE and lower cost, and you have higher conservation values. But my essential assessment is that U.S. fisheries policy has mistakenly assumed that stopping overfishing was a necessary step to maximize the benefits from our fishery. And what I want to argue is that in mixed stock fisheries, we will have and we should have some overfishing. Okay? And just to go even farther out on the limb, I would contend that the precautionary management that we have in place, including everything from the 10-year rebuilding requirement to the idea that we should have no stock subject to overfishing to the 2 million ton cap in the Bering Sea, is keeping us from realizing the potential benefits from the fisheries that are, in fact, the core objective of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. So this is a paper that Chris Costello and I did this year, or last year, I guess now, where we basically try to estimate the potential for higher fish yield, profit, and abundance of fish. And this was a worldwide look, but I'm going to zoom in on the U.S. in a couple slides. So first I want to just do a briefing of how we often look at the status of fish stocks in different places. And we do this by looking at the stock size on one axis and the fishing pressure on the other. So, and if we assume that the middle point is the target, usually defined in maximum sustainable yield terms, but where we want to be, then within the U.S. we call anything that's less than half of this overfished. And in the U.S. we call anything that's above that target overfishing. So you can be both overfished and overfishing. That's the worst possible case. You can be overfishing but not overfished. You can be overfished but not overfishing. I don't think NOAA actually has the term fully exploited. I don't think, but and who's part of that email thread with FAO? What did we just discuss? Prudently fished, I think. That's what we've decided is the right term. Prudently fished, and then again, this is definitely not a NOAA term, but I will say underfished. That is stocks that are underexploited, stocks that are at quite high abundance. Okay, now we can look at. Here's the status of U.S. stocks in the most recent data draw, or close to the most recent data draw I've been able to do. On that same graph, with one in biomass and one in fishing pressure being our targets for maximum sustained yield. It's not to say that is the objective of fisheries, because it clearly isn't the objective, but if it was, that's, and then the size of the circle is the potential yield from the stock, or the maximum sustained yield. So this is undoubtedly Alaska pollock. This is all in tons, not value. And what you see is, and this plus mark is the median value. And what we see is that on average, U.S. fish stocks are about 50% higher than the MSY target, and the fishing pressure is about 60% of the MSY target. And we still have some stocks in the bad zone. Not a lot, and they're not the big stocks. We have some stocks down in the rebuilding zone. And for those of you PhD students, if I'm on your committee, I might give you this graph and ask you to say, which stocks in this space are rebuilding? And I bet most of you will get it wrong. And then the shading is how much of the yield is being lost at the current fishing pressure. So if you are fishing near 1 on the y-axis, you're getting nearly 90% or more of the potential yield if you just keep fishing that hard every year. If you're way up there, above, say, 1.5 or 2, you're losing at least 40% of the potential yield, because the stock is not going to go extinct, but it's going to go to low abundance, and the long-term yield will be lower. But similarly, if you're fishing down here, you're losing 40% or more of your potential yield. Okay? And if you just look at the color of that graph, it's dominantly red. But if you integrate across area and color, and if you put that together, this is the big pie is if we could somehow magically manage everything at the level that produces maximum sustained yield. What you see in red is how much we're losing by overfishing, and what you see in yellow is how much we're losing by underfishing. Okay? The point here is and this is why Greenpeace hates me, is that overfishing is not causing us to lose very much of the potential benefits of U.S. fisheries, but conservative management is, if we could manage every stock separately, which we can't, okay? So it's not achievable. In mixed stocks, we can't maximize everything. And many of those stocks that are underfished, it's largely because of markets, that there simply isn't, the price is either too low or the processing plant simply won't take any more. Clearly, in general, economic performance would be better with less effort, higher abundance, and potentially higher price, although then you get into issues of trade violation. Also, if you're managing maximum sustained yield, there's concerns about the impact on other species through bycatch and through food webs. So there's lots of reasons that MSY isn't the target, but if you go back to Magnuson-Stevens, it talks about food and employment and profitability. It's in terms of something we can quantify. Until Congress gets more specific, it's certainly a touch point. Okay, now I want to look at what happened here. Oh no, this is not promising. Oh no, okay, it'll work out. It'll be okay. This is again for the West Coast fishery. This is from undergraduate student Kristen Cochran. This is part of her capstone, and these are data that that Preeti Kuriyama had in his thesis as well. That was pointing out that this is the catch to TAC ratio. So what's the catch divided by the allowable catch? And what we see for the West Coast groundfish fishery is that on average, we're only catching about 25% of what is being set as the allowable catch. So we're not only are the allowable catches have a number of precautionary elements in them, even once we set it, we're not catching the fish, okay? For some stocks, we're down at 5 or 10% of their TAC. Sablefish, which is the money fish in this fishery, is reasonably fully exploited, but even that, it's only about 85%. So, and that's a really interesting question that, in fact, it's what Kristen's doing her capstone on, is really trying to understand why that's happening. Let's see. Oops. Here's some of the reasons. One is the term we use is choke species. That is, there is so little quota for some species that you can't go out and catch an abundant species without exceeding the quota of the choke species. So the classic example is yellow eye rockfish, where the total quota for the West Coast is, at least the last time I had the data, most recent data is 4 tons. It works out that, well, maybe it's higher now, but that some boats, their total allowable catch for the year was 4 pounds, okay? So they catch more than 4 pounds of yellow eye rockfish, they have to stop fishing for the year, unless they can find somebody else who will sell them or lease them some more quota. Markets is a big one. If you go and ask fishermen why they aren't catching more of this, they say, like, processors won't take it, there's no markets. Now, that's an interesting one because essentially the markets for this group of fish dramatically declined as we cut back the catches, and what used to be markets for these fish were, well, the markets were taken over by the Canadians who were not cutting back their catch, or tilapia and pangasius from Asia. And then there's some issue of closed areas. So we've got these rockfish conservation areas. In some cases, some of these species are largely in those areas. We have trouble getting to them. This is a graph of the time pattern of catch to TAC. And you see, back in 2002, we're catching 70% of the TAC. And now it's down to about 25%. And that's all because the TAC has been growing. So stocks have been rebuilding, we're increasing the TAC, but the catch hasn't been increasing. And largely because we think of choke species and markets, but we're not sure about that. So I was pointing this out when we were in Washington, D.C. with Olaf and Julia, and I said, look, there's something wrong with U.S. fisheries policy that we aren't catching We aren't catching our TACs, and look at how much catch in the West Coast and New England has declined. And what they both said, yeah, but what would have happened if we hadn't done this? What would have happened if we'd kept fishing like we had back in the 1990s? So this is my first cut estimate of what would have happened if we kept fishing in the 1990s. The solid line is the actual catch, and the dotted line is what would have happened if we kept fishing like we were in the 1990s. We would be catching 3 times more fish than we are now. Now, we would have 7 or 8 stocks that would be overfished. And so if our objective is to not overfish, we would be doing poorly. But if our objective is to produce fish, we would be doing much better than we are now. Very, very preliminary. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm overestimating it, but okay, so we would some stocks would have remained overfished, and we really need to explore a range of alternative management histories. That one was just assuming the annual fraction harvested stayed the same. It'd be interesting to put in the rockfish conservation areas by themselves, just reducing fishing mortality rate to FMSY. Okay, related to this, I just want to bring in another paper by Jim Thorson that Olaf and I were sort of minor contributors, I have to say. And what he was doing is looking at the fact that because fish stocks have natural fluctuation, and in this case in recruitment, and they're often highly autocorrelated, that stocks get a series of good years, a series of bad years, that if you were to fish stocks at FMSY, that 8% of the time, on average, they would be overfished. So this goes to the point of, well, how many stocks should be overfished? And the idea that somehow in an ideal world, nothing is overfished. Well, if you're trying to maximize yield, and this is a very optimistic calculation, you would have 8% of stocks overfished. That is assuming perfect information and perfect manageability. If all of a sudden you put in uncertainty in your stock assessment and imprecision in your management, I wouldn't be surprised if that number is going to rise to 15 or 20%. But using the 8%, so if we have 316 stocks of known status, fish to maximize sustainable yield, we'd expect to have 25% of them overfished. Okay, there's some other objectives. So we are also concerned about habitat, and we're concerned about these for their own sake. We're concerned about habitat for its own sake, and because it, in theory, contributes to the productivity of resources. We are interested in marine mammals, marine birds, and marine reptiles, and we're also interested in sport fishing. And Jen Griffiths was a student, Daniel Schindler's up in Alaska. Her first fish she ever caught was in a trout farm, a half-pound trout. The second fish she ever caught was a 50-pound king salmon. Well, actually, she was really smiling previously. She's sort of frowning at this point. It took about an hour for her to get that fish in the boat. So how are we doing with respect to these? It's a little bit hard to tell. Oh, yes, okay, good. I thought I'd fix that slide up. Through another project, I do have data on trawl footprint. So I'm sure you all know that trawling is destroying the oceans, and that the trawlers are going deeper and deeper and destroying more and more of the oceans. Well, for these regions in the US, we have reasonably detailed data on how much of the ocean bottom is being trawled each year. And you see that there is generally, the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea, it dropped off in the 1990s, been stable. Gulf of Alaska, Gulf of Mexico. What we find is that within all the US areas where we have data, trawl footprint is declining. So the impact on habitat is reducing. Should also say that trawling goes to the same places year in, year out, year in, year out. And it's not as if they destroy one area and move somewhere else. Certainly within the realm of the kind of data we have, that could have happened 20, 30 years ago. It could happen in other places, but we've got data for 30 different regions of the world, and we see this over and over again. Just go back to the same place, year in, year out. And generally in the developed world, trawl footprints are declining as fishing pressure has been reduced. Status of marine, this is a report that Paul Wade, who's out at the Marine Mammal Lab, but it goes back to 2000, and so I couldn't find anything more recent that really is saying what is the status of marine mammals or marine birds. As of 2000, most baleen whales were recovering, all mainland pinnipeds were increasing, many cetaceans were uncertain. Just want to emphasize that we do have other objectives, but we just don't seem to be putting the resources into them to be tracking them with the same reliability that we do with the Fisheries Sustainability Index. If you go to Washington, D.C. and talk to anyone about Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization, the first thing they tell you is it's all about Gulf of Mexico red snapper. There's a whole bunch of senators and congressmen from the Gulf that are hot to trot about this issue. And the other advice they get is don't go anywhere near it, you know. And but more broadly, there is great dissatisfaction in the recreational fishing community with federal management. Part of it is definitely allocation. Okay, they just think they should be getting a bigger share. But some of it is, or a lot of it is also that their perspective, and in this point I have to agree with them, is that they're basically being managed by a system developed to rebuild New England groundfish. That in fact, you know, the national standards tended to come out of problems in New England, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction. I just did another briefing of non-governmental organizations 3-4 weeks ago in D.C. And mostly I started out with Conservation International, WWF, Oceana, and Ocean Conservancy. But in between, I went to the American Sportfish Association, and you know, and they're very dissatisfied with the federal management system. And they argue, of course, that it's a giant, you know, it's much more valuable than commercial fishing, and it certainly is very valuable. Okay, I want to wrap up just talking about my message to Congress. What did I actually say? I got 5 minutes, but you can actually give them written testimony that's longer. First is, good job, boys. U.S. fish stocks are increasing and on average well above maximum sustained yield levels, and that the success has been achieved by funding NOAA to actually do the science and to do the management. Regionalization of fisheries management decisions. I certainly think that the idea of trying to manage your fisheries from Washington, D.C. is a really bad idea. Canada still largely tries to do that from Ottawa, and I think it's led to a lot of problems. Stopping the race to fish in many U.S. fisheries, we have done various things that eliminate the competitive race to fish. But very importantly is requiring managers to follow science advice regarding allowable levels of harvest. You don't want those decisions to be made politically. You want the politicians to tell you what their objectives are and state those, and then have the scientists say, well, if that's what you want, here's how you do it. And the reductions in fishing pressure in the 1990s led to rebuilding. Okay. Nothing too controversial there, and I think, but would say that the major threats to U.S. fish stocks and marine ecosystem biodiversity are now ocean acidification, warming temperatures, better term than what climate change, degraded coastal habitats, exotic species, land-based runoff, and pollution. Overfishing remains a concern for a limited number of stocks, but shouldn't continue to be the most important concern in U.S. Federal fisheries policy. This is really the core. Basically, I'm saying to Congress, figure out what our objectives are and state them in a way that we can operationalize it. So if you were to decide, if Congress were to decide what the relative importance of various objectives of fisheries management should be, that is it profit, jobs, yield, environmental protection, the science community could give you guidance on the recommended levels of harvest. And emphasizing that the social and economic record of U.S. fisheries is much more mixed than biological success. If Gulf red snapper is the elephant in the room for Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization, 10-year rebuilding requirement is the hippopotamus in the room. It's the second issue. And that, I think, is easily resolved by yet another National Academy of Sciences committee. This one chaired by two former alumni, Anna Parma and Pat Sullivan, including Andre Punt, so very distinguished group. And I simply can't do anything but say I agree with them. And what they said is rebuilding plans that focus on meeting selected fishing mortality targets, in other words, harvest rates, rather than exact schedules for obtaining biomass targets, may be more robust to assessment uncertainty, natural variability, and ecosystem considerations, and have lower social and economic impacts. So, is it really Congress that matters? Okay, and again, I'm very much an amateur at this. I've done 2 briefings, and now over the last 25 years, 3 Senate or House hearings. Generally, the conventional wisdom is staffers are the key. You know, that they're the ones who essentially tell their bosses how to respond to issues. I think the NGOs are increasingly important, and NGOs come in all flavors, from environmental NGOs to industry NGOs. But you know, as you probably know, a lot of legislation is being written by NGOs who then pass it up through their client congressman. So in terms of getting the message to Congress, I would rephrase it as getting the message to DC, and that's why after the briefings we did in October, we didn't have time to go to NGOs. I went back to see the NGOs. And one of the things I was told, fisheries has generally been a pretty nonpartisan issue. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, Democrat, Republican. You know, Senator Stevens, during his tenure, was the real force there. But Senator Hollings, Senator NOAA were the Democrats, and they were working quite closely together. That seems to be falling apart a little bit. Again, side conversations, they said, well, basically the environmental NGOs tell the Democrats what they want in the law, and the Republicans say, well, if that's what the environmental NGOs want, we want something else. But from the point of view of scientists, the key is to communicate the science to the broad community of stakeholders. And, sorry. If you want your work to impact policy, you just need to work with the stakeholders. And so those of you who work in applied fields or are interested in changing how fisheries are management, just have to identify the stakeholders and spend time with them. So I just want to go back to these things. Maintain on a continuing basis optimum yield. Encourage the development of fisheries which are currently underutilized. So I read that, I look at my plot, and I say, well, we got all these stocks that are harvested at half or less than maximum sustainable yield. Maybe the law is telling us we really should be trying to figure out how to do that. I look at West Coast groundfish, and I say, well, we got all these resources that are very lightly exploited, much less than their TACs. What could we be doing in national fisheries policy to increase the use of those things? Optimum yield, remember, benefits with respect to food, production, and recreation. I want to just emphasize that. And so my bottom conclusions is we have achieved rebuilding by setting targets. There's no question in my mind, for the last 20 years, the focus of U.S. fisheries policy has been rebuilding stocks. But it's not the goal. It's a means to an end. And it's what I would call a classic example of goal displacement, where a management action becomes the end in itself, as opposed to stepping back and say, what are we really trying to achieve? I think we need to, actually set targets with what we want in terms of yield, jobs, recreational profits, and ecosystem status, and we need to monitor our performance with respect to those measures. So what I would love to see 5 years from now in the NOAA main webpage would be sort of equal weight to these things and much less emphasis on how many stocks are subject to overfishing. So that's the end. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a good number of questions, and then we will develop food and recreation outside. Liz.
So take West Coast groundfish, and let's say you're right, which I believe, that markets are limiting how much fish is processed. Does it also say to you that new markets are being opened by the processors or the fishermen, that everybody's happy with the profits they're making on the West Coast fishery right now? And that if they weren't, they'd be pushing to opening new markets or processing underutilized fish?
You know, I really don't know the answer to that. I'm certainly talking to people in the fishing industry. Everyone is not happy, Liz.
Oh, I know. I'm sure that's
and
absolutely
talking to
what
people
you're
in New England, I guarantee you everyone is not happy.
I
In
was
fact,
just
the only
saying
happy
that's
guy
what-
just got sent to jail.
But on the West Coast, I don't see any movement by the industry to develop new
I know, and I.
I'm wondering.
Well, I wonder about, you know, this was not an issue I was aware of 6 months ago, you know, that there was so, I mean, I just went into this analysis assuming it was choke species. And, you know, I mean, well, another factor is the fleet is so much smaller now. And you know, maybe we don't have enough boats, but I don't know. I mean, you guys who work on the West Coast fishery directly probably have a better idea of that.
Well, you've lost small processing capacity.
Yeah.
Because all, you know, and you've lost small fishing
Yeah.
entities, and you've lost a number of fishermen because of the
Yeah,
drawback
yeah.
of the
Yeah.
catch.
And you have one dominant processor now on the West Coast. Yeah, I mean, that is the facts of life. So I don't know what they do, 80% of it. So, you know, maybe they are happy. You know, I don't know, but I you know, I think that's a really interesting question. But you know, if you compare the catch to TAC ratios here, and New England's a little better, but part of that is New England doesn't have 100% observer coverage. And everybody I've talked to from there says there's still a lot of discarding going on in New England. If you go to Canada, the catch to TAC, West Coast Canada, same mix more or less, catch to TAC ratio is about 75%. But they've never had these super dramatic reductions in TAC. You know, that the choke species are not throttling them, they're sort of like that. I mean, they still pay 3 or 4 times the ex-vessel value for a ton of boccaccio quota. But boccaccio didn't drop to the, you know, the catches didn't go way down. And that's one of the things we're hoping to do, is see if we can actually quantify choke. And last year we had a visitor from the European Commission, Ernesto Peñas, who came to see how we deal with mixed stock fisheries, because the European Commission has just decided they should stop, not allow discarding. And so in theory, they have to do like we do, stop fishing when you reach your limits. And right now they're running 70 or 80% of their TACs. But if they could effectively enforce no discarding, I would assume the same thing would happen to them here. But and we're just had a conference call on that today.
Chris, an economist. Let's see where.
Well, I'm going to ask a political science question, I guess. So at one point you mentioned that Magnuson has regionalized fishery management, and that was a good thing, right? And really what they've said is that everybody naturally has to meet biological standards, and then you can choose how you pursue these other social actual goals under that on a regional basis.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're making the point that
Go on.
Well, in theory, I would agree, but having seen how some councils have behaved at various times, I would be a little leery. I certainly agree that more. Is that my phone? Why do phones go off when they're in your pocket? Would somebody? Your phone is ringing now in here. Anyway, I don't know. That's the answer is. I think that there is an appropriate level of decentralization, but you remember there's as wonderful as the council system is, councils are no more than the people who are on them. Okay, as wonderful as our wise people are in D.C., they're no better than whoever is making those decisions. So I'm gonna punt on that one.
I tried to get you to say something controversial.
No.
I finished my 57th year of fishing in Bristol Bay, and think of a system that has built itself back up because of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. In 1972, we had one 12-hour fishing period, and the rest of the season was to rebuild the stocks. In 73, there was no fishery at all. And as Senator Stevens and Senator Magnuson put this together and went to NOAA and got foreign fleets off the fishery just outside on the Bering Sea side, the fishery is back to 65 million. Managed by so many that come out of this school. I can't appreciate you guys any more than I can. I mean, it's unbelievable to go and sit out in the tundra, manage fisheries to sustain yield. What an example for the rest of the world to see. It's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
The whole threat that we have now is the possibility of a pebble mine.
100% agree with you, but remember that the federal role was largely to help get rid of the high seas interception. And Alaska Fish and Game deserves most of the credit for, managing the fishery. I use this all the time. One of the unique aspects of Bristol Bay, and I suspect many other areas in Alaska, is there is individual responsibility for management decisions. That if you want to know, if you want to say, well, why was that fishery open today in the Nushagak district? You go talk to the manager. You can go into his office in a way that there's no analog in any other place I can think of where you have. And when if a manager under escapes his stock, he is criticized within his agency, and they've got a great culture that way, for sure. We're going to put Andre in charge of the sardine fishery individually, right?
I closed it, didn't I? So let's give Ray an opportunity to be controversial. So you're now in charge. You've got to rewrite the Magnuson Act. No typos. You've got rid of the 10-year rule, because that's the easy thing, right? You struck that out of the Magnuson Act. The Act is sort of built around MSY. And the ultimate, I think everyone agrees with your final slide, which is if we had objectives, we would be able to come up with control rules to get us there.
Yeah, we mean the science community.
We mean the science. That's the sort of easy thing. The question is, how do you get decision makers to actually get to a point of agreeing that trade-off between the objectives? Because right now we've accepted the default trade-off, which is MSY, because that's what we were told in the 1950s. Once you start getting into those trade-offs, Australia has. They've said maximize economic yield. How do we do that in the US? Other than
well, our government is working so effectively now that I just think you get the president and Congress and you make a deal, right?
So we can maximize yield without dropping the stock.
Actually, in the grand scheme of things, I think that what Australia has done is a pretty good compromise. You know, that if you say, no, it's not maximum sustained yield, it's maximum economic yield, or operationally that becomes, you know, 80% of FMSY instead of FMSY, your biomass target is higher. You know, in a rational political world, you might be able to do that. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily, you certainly wouldn't want, many Americans would not want us to maximize the economic performance of the fisheries, because in Bristol Bay, you would cut the fleet down to 200 boats. You know, so we have a lot of other objectives, social objectives, that would not be achieved by pure economic maximization at some ends. But in terms of a harvest strategy, I think you know, an EMSY policy would probably be a pretty good compromise. But I don't see it happening. You know, I think that I was just on a conference call today where we were going over the proposed changes to the House bill that has come out of the House committee, and I mean, it's so complex. I mean, that's, you know, I hope some of you are from School of Marine Affairs. You guys can go do that kind of stuff. It's much harder than just, as Andre says, all this modeling stuff is easy.
Okay, having just degraded my entire career, let's thank Ray and let's improve our food security.
Oh, nothing outrageous, really.
No, I could have been more outrageous.
Yeah, I'm sure you could have. I'm just getting too mellow in my old age.
Hey, Ray, I talked to fishermen. That's how I knew that it was a market issue.
Yeah.
That they couldn't dump the fish.
Yeah. Well, they can. They just
Nobody will
told,
take
don't
it.
bring us any more than that. Yeah.
No, they'll call in and say to the processor,
Yeah.
what are you taking to them?
And
And if they are not taking
Well,
Dover.
You could print Dover sole.
So, yeah. I don't really want it. I'm not going to steal it, but I could walk off with it accidentally.
Project the rest of your conversations through 102 for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Thank you.